Hello, it's Keith here again. We're going to be beta testing again today, this time on the Amstrad CPC Plus. Now it's going to be a bit different today because I actually came across quite an unusual bug or two when I was doing a bit of pre-testing earlier on in the week. Now my Amstrad CPC isn't in a very good state, it's a bit worn out, so I had to do some testing on it just to make sure it still worked, and it sort of did, sort of didn't. But anyway, the hardware aside, when I was doing some testing, I found the game actually wasn't playable, which quite shocked me because this game has been thoroughly tested on the emulators, and what actually happened was not just one but two bugs came up on physical hardware that did not come up on the emulator. And this is really, unfortunately, the kind of time when you learn just testing on emulators is not enough if you want to be sure your games work correctly. So anyway, we're going to have a look at my hardware. I'm going to discuss the problems with it, and with the hardware that is, and then we're going to have a look at the game, and I'm going to talk through the procedure I did for debugging problems that only exhibit themselves on hardware when I had no debugging tools on that hardware. I've got no disassemblers, no state monitors. I can't even see the state of the registers, so it's really, feeling around in the dark, trying to work out what the problem is and fix it. So anyway, let's have a look at the hardware on the overhead camera. Okay, so here's my Amstrad CPC Plus. This is a 6128 model. That means it's got 128k memory, of course. So I'm using another of these SD card emulators. It's not the same one, it's a different one, but they do look identical. We've got a cable that I made myself here. All it is a standard floppy cable with one of these unplug it with one of these Centronics connectors on it. You just jam it in. There is a pin missing on the end. There's a guide on the CPC wiki on how to do this, but it's very simple. And because the emulators simulate the ready state, you don't have to worry about messing with the cable, putting it in a jumper, or doing anything with regards to modifying the drive. I've just got a 5-volt line connected to a standard floppy connector here just to power it, so I'm just powering it off that. I'm using another RGB cable here. It's a different one to the regular Amstrad CPC though. So yep, you can use the same. I'm using the same box, but the actual cable is different. Now you will see here that I've got a rather odd device, and you're probably thinking, well, what's that and what's this? And this comes to one of the problems with this machine. Now the internal 128k memory, the first base 64k is okay, but one of the chips that make up the extended 128k has actually failed. This means that games that use the 128k memory don't work on this machine anymore. I'm getting around that by using Toto's X-Men, which is a 512k memory upgrade, but it overrides the internal 64k, disabling it. And so as long as I've got this plugged in, the game will work, or any game will work fine on this machine. Now I do need to point out at this point that ChibiAkumas does not require 512k of memory to run. If you had a working 128k machine, you wouldn't need this. I'm just using this because my machine is now faulty. I do have the parts to repair this machine, but this is my only CPC Plus, and I'm a bit apprehensive to take it apart and start having a go at it with a soldering iron. When I do need it to work, it does still just about work, and if I make a mistake messing with my soldering iron, I might damage it. So I'm not doing that at this stage. So powering it, I'm just using a 5-volt center positive cable here. You'll see this has actually got two wires, and you may be wondering why that is. Well, there's a very slight difference in the socket on the Amstrad CPC Plus and the Amstrad CPC, and neither plug quite works on both. So I do have two just to get around that, but they're both wired to the same power adapter at the end. And then I'm using a C4 CPC emulator here that emulates the cartridge. The Amstrad CPC Plus, for those who don't know, will not work without some kind of cartridge inserted. This is a French machine, so it's a ZERTY, and by using the C4 CPC to emulate the firmware, I can change this to a QWERTY keyboard, which helps me a bit starting the games, but also I can simulate the power DOS, so I can use the larger disk images. So C4 CPC, even if you're not planning on emulating cartridges, is a great way of replacing your internal firmware. Okay, and then I'm using the standard Amstrad joypad today. As I mentioned before, I can't use my 3-button joystick on this machine because even though the joystick supports 3 buttons, unlike the regular 464 and 6128, the Plus machines are physically not wired to support that 3rd button, so I can only use 2 buttons, so I might as well use the real joypad. One final thing I wanted to show you is this. Now, as I said, there are multiple problems with this machine. The first one was the memory, which I'm overcoming by using a memory upgrade, but then the other one was that the keyboard membrane has had serious problems with it. It's working at the moment, but it has had various problems. One of those is some of the lines were actually damaged, and I've used this electric paint here. I've fixed many membranes with this. It's quite expensive. It's about £10 per tube, but I think I've fixed 4 keyboards with this, and I've barely used any of it. So if you're going to buy these second-hand machines and you want to keep them working, this is definitely something to get because it works great. Opening the keyboard up, I'm not going to do it, but it's very easy. You just unscrew the machine, you gently pry all the clips off, the 2 parts separate, you separate the membranes. Now, the important thing with membranes on computers is if you need to clean them, do not clean them with anything chemical like isopropyl alcohol, because it will dissolve the membrane, dissolve the paint off the membrane, sorry. So what you want to do is just use, I'm told soap and water, but I actually just use water. I just use a little bit of water and a Q-tip or a piece of kitchen towel, and I just wipe it with the water. So fixing the cracks in the membrane with this, and then just cleaning it. And this time it was actually just needed cleaning. It got a bit cruddy, I guess, a bit of mold or something, condensation building up on it. Do have terrible mold problems in my apartment, so I do keep these all in boxes with silica gel. But as I say, I'd use the electric paint on this. I guess maybe I hadn't cleaned it well enough in the past. But this membrane, when I came to it at the weekend, only neither of the shift keys worked, and a few of the keys were playing up. So now it's working fine, I think. So it's good to go again. So yeah, electric paint, clean the membrane with water, and the external memory upgrade, and this machine is good to go. But as I say, there were some software problems with it, but we've got around them as well. Anyway, let's turn off this camera and let's go to the screen view and let's have a look at the game. Okay, so let's start the game. Now, this machine has the external virtual floppy drive, so I need to change to drive B. And then we can just start the game with one disk. Okay, so while we're playing today, I'm actually going to talk through the problems I encountered and how I tried to debug them based on the fact that I couldn't really use any of the debugging tools we would usually use on an emulator. Now, the game started loading fine. The problems only started to exhibit themselves during gameplay. So at this point, everything was as it was normally, and it was the loading screen that the problems first came to light on. I'll just explain a little bit of how the CPC Plus version works with its color changes. The normal Amstrad CPC has 6 interrupt switches during the screen redraw, but on the CPC Plus they're configurable, and you can configure them to any line you want. If you look at this screen, you'll notice the very bottom of the screen is green. The warning word at the bottom, just below the press fire to continue, the warning line is green. Now, when this screen appeared in gameplay, the entire screen was green. This told me something quite important about how the system is actually running. So I just plugged the speakers back in. There we go. When I was debugging the problem, I hadn't actually got the speakers plugged in, but if I had, I would have noticed the sound was also running very fast. Now, the fact the sound is running very fast implies that the interrupts are firing too often, and the fact that the entire screen is coloured the colour of the bottom of the screen, and the fact that the sound is playing too fast tells me that the screen has drawn itself once, but is now not resetting to redraw itself again. ChibiAkumas, the interrupt handler on the CPC Plus, updates the sound at the bottom line of the screen. So all of this told me quite clearly that there was something wrong with the interrupt handler, that the interrupt handler was starting to work, but it then wasn't continuing to the second execution. And my first guess was that maybe there was some difference in the way that the emulators, because of course none of these problems exhibited on the emulators, that maybe the emulators allowed line 200 as the last line, but the real hardware had the last line as 199. So I reprogrammed the code, copied it to my SD card. If you had an M4, you could do it wirelessly, but I don't use that. So I always copy to the SD card, put the SD card in, run the game again, and try to find if the problem's still happening. So every time I was trying something, I was having to recompile and retest on my SD card. So I changed the last line to 199. Right from 200, and that didn't fix the problem, so that obviously wasn't the problem. So then I had to have a look at my code again and have another look at what could be causing the problem. As I say, I knew the screen was drawing, but then the refresh wasn't occurring. Now, the way the refresh occurs is the line number, when it gets to line 200, it resets it to 0, which is the top of the screen, and then when the top of the screen occurs, it then resets all of its code so that it will restart redrawing the colours again, very much like my tutorials on raster interrupts. If you've seen that, the tutorials were actually based on the code from the game. So I just need to reconfigure my keys here. I'm going to use my joypad, so up, down, left, right, fire 1, fire 2, space, pause. And we do have to set the second player even if we're not playing a second player. But we can set both pauses to the same key. So okay, anyway, so as I was saying, so I suspected that there was something wrong with the way it was refreshing, because the last interrupt seemed to be firing over and over again, as if it was stuck at the bottom of the screen. So I had a look at my code, and the way my code detects whether it's now time to refresh is it reads in the data from the interrupt line. Now, the way this CPC Plus works with regards to its special features is there's a bank of what's known as ASIC memory that appears. It's not a real physical bank of memory, it's actually the special control codes of the ASIC chip, which does all of the Plus features. So that appears at the 4000 range, and I think it's the memory address 6800 that programs the ASIC what line you want the interrupt to occur next. So what I was doing to check if it was now back at the top of the screen was I was reading from that memory address and checking if it was 0, and that worked fine on the on WinApe, and I believe also on Arnold. Both of those that worked absolutely fine. But having reread the documentation on the CPC Plus, I've now realised that what I was doing was incorrect. You cannot rely on the data that will come out of reading those memory addresses. You can write to them, but if you read back, you will not get the same data. Well, I mean, I was going to say necessarily, but certainly won't, because it didn't work. If you did, it would have worked, and it wasn't working at all. So that seems to be a discrepancy with regards to the way the CPC Plus, the physical CPC Plus, and the emulators work. Because, as I say, it certainly wasn't working. It wasn't just working a little bit and occasionally wasn't. It wasn't working at all. So that was quite a surprise to me. And then the other problem I was having, well, I say the main problem that sort of exhibits is this game has been thoroughly tested on emulators, and that never happened. So it does really reiterate how important having the physical hardware to test on, which I know will be a problem for people, and it's not really convenient for me. Things like the 464 Plus, I don't own one, and you know, 664, well, forget it, no chance. So owning real hardware is real tough, and it's going to get more expensive as the hardware starts wearing out. So it's a shame for people developing games, but it does seem to still be necessary to really say your game's fully tested. But anyway, so that was the first problem fixed, and now the game looked exactly like it does now. Everything's fine. So you think, oh, that's great. No more problems, because you know that was a strange problem, but easily fixed. But then I noticed another even worse problem. Well, arguably worse. When the game went to the continue screen, it was actually crashing, completely crashing. And that was like, well, yeah, what's changed there? There's nothing special about that. The only thing that there was is that there's a command to reset the CPC interrupt handler, the CPC Plus interrupt handler, because the CPC Plus interrupt handler works on a specific line, whereas the regular one works 6 times per screen. If you leave the CPC Plus one enabled during the continue screen, it runs super slow with the firmware. So when the firmware enables, I have to disable the Plus interrupt handler. So I thought maybe it was that. So I tried removing that line, but it still crashed. And I'm like, okay, well, that's very odd. And so what it tends to come down to is when the game's crashing and you've got nothing to help, no debugging tools to help you, the first thing to do is you have to look at what's going on carefully and see what's happening. What are you actually seeing? And in this case, what I was seeing is the screen was going blank, and then nothing. There's nothing appearing on the screen. Now, if I looked at the source code, the first line to clear the screen, well, that was working because the screen was going blank. But then the next line was supposed to draw the background sprite. Okay. So there was no sign of that even starting. It wasn't that it was starting and then corrupting the memory and the game was crashing. It wasn't even starting. There was no sign of it doing anything. So, okay, well, so my next stage was to compile another version of the game without that screen showing. And then everything worked fine. Well, that's quite surprising, you know. Well, that screen was crashing the game. But this is the same screen on the CPC. There's no difference in it on the CPC Plus, and it's been the same since forever. So it'd be surprising if there's something wrong there. But anyway, yeah, I had a look at the code and of the screen, and I tested it, and it works even in... You can even run it from BASIC. It's so crude. There's really nothing controversial about it at all. And it's like, well, if it runs from BASIC, then it's not going to be corrupting the firmware because the firmware is running in BASIC. So it really was quite a surprise there as what's going on. So, well, I didn't really have any particular idea at this point. So I thought, well, okay, let's try something a bit screwy. Let's try showing a different screen. Instead of showing the continue screen, let's show the loading screen. Loading screen shows fine. Well, okay, well, the continue routine's obviously working okay. So this doesn't seem to be to do with the screen, because the screen works. Doesn't seem to be it's anything to do with the code that does the continue page, because that works with the other screen. So maybe this is corruption. Maybe the data of the loading of the continue screen is getting corrupted. Oh, that's one other thing I did. I tried showing the continue screen during the first load of while the game started, and it worked there as well. So again, well, it's not the file on the disk. It's not the procedure of showing the screen. This screen you see now. It's not the procedure of showing that screen. It's actually something else. It's actually it's actually something's going wrong and corrupting the screen. Now, of course, the CPC Plus version is mostly the same as the regular CPC version. It's all been thoroughly tested. The vast majority, the sprite code is identical from episode 2. None of it's changed. So what has changed, and what have we had problems with today? Well, the finger points to the interrupt handler, doesn't it? So I didn't really have any explanations at this point as to why the interrupt handler would be causing that corruption. But the interrupt handler had to be my first port of call with regards to what does the Plus do specially and what could be going wrong. So anyway, so I took the interrupt handler code, and again I made a special build of the game where the raster colors didn't draw, and I tried that so the raster colors didn't change, so the entire screen was just one color. And so then I ran that game, and the continue screen now showed, but there was 1 pixel of corruption right in the middle. Now, if you look at the data in that bank, that shows the loading, the continue, and the game over, and the insert disk screen, there's 3 chunks, and they use 2/3 of the bank, and the last third of the bank is used by the font. And this bank would, of course, be paged into the 4,000 to 8,000 range, wherever all the banks page into in this game. Now, being as there was 1 spot of corruption when the in the middle of the range, because that's where the continue screen was, and I was now only doing 1 thing in the ASIC page, which was set the next interrupt line, it became very suspicious that maybe the interrupt handler was, rather than writing its data to the ASIC, was actually writing it to the bank with the font in it for some reason, like, for example, if the interrupt occurred while the font was drawing. There was no logical reason why this should do this, and as this game has been played for, at this point, dozens of hours. Most of my testing's on the Plus, so the amount of time that this interrupt handler has been run on the Plus is insane on the emulator, but it never corrupted. But my theory was that the corruption was occurring because of the interrupt handler. So I reprogrammed the interrupt handler to force the memory bank to bank 0 rather than leaving it where it currently was, and the problem went away. So it seems that and I suspect this isn't actually a problem with the emulators compared to the real hardware. I suspect this is my external bank. Remember I said my 128K memory is faulty in the machine, so I'm using an XMEM. Now the XMEM overrides the internal memory, but I have a suspicion that if you imagine the bottom layer as being the internal 64K, and the ASIC and the Plus and the external memory or the internal memory overlaying above that, I suspect the XMEM's memory is in some cases overlaying above the ASIC, so that the write was occurring to the XMEM's memory rather than the ASIC memory, whereas the physical internal memory of the 6128 would have appeared below it. I really can't test it much further than this without proper debugging tools, which I don't have because it's a physical machine, not an emulator. But that's certainly the symptoms I saw when I programmed to protect against those when I programmed in a way to protect against that hypothesis, the problem went away. The game works fine now. So that seems to have fixed it, and that I'm going to stick with that hypothesis of the problem. As I say, I suspect it wouldn't have ever happened on a real normal CPC, but my XMEM upgraded faulty 6128 was suffering that problem. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed seeing the game today. A bit of a change. As you see, this is the kind of the premium version of the CPC version because it's got the plus enhanced features. Oh, whatever. Let's try a little bit more. Let's play the first half of the third level. So I haven't shown this one before, but so you get these cut screens in between levels. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the plus features just to tell you what the enhancements of the game are. So you get 8 raster switches on the plus version rather than the 5 that the normal version has, and also it's using the plus palette. So you can see there the water's blue, the sky's very purple, the in-between is kind of green and cyan. You get a lot more colours. Now I don't know if you can tell on the camera, but the Chibico character is flickering very fast. This is intentional and it's disableable if you don't like it. The CPC Plus, you see, it's using the CPC Plus sprites, which are 16 colour for the Chibico character and the Botchan character, the second player. Now, they always appear but above everything else, and because you need really pixel precision targeting with regards to avoiding the bullets, I needed you to be able to see where the bullets were, even though by the hardware's restrictions, the Chibico character would always appear above. So what I do is I flicker the sprite on and off at 50 Hertz. So every other frame that the screen redraws, every other screen refresh, sorry, not frame, that the screen draws, so that it will kind of appear semi-transparent. Now, I'm using a VGA box here, so it would probably work even better. It looks pretty good on here, but it would probably work even better on physical, on a real screen. But if it even works fine on an emulator, it's not uncomfortable anyway. But if you don't like it, if you go into the settings, there's an option to disable it, because I know that depending on people's hardware and eyes, it may not be so nice. It doesn't work very nice on my 4K screen because my 4K screen's plugged in with a 30 Hertz HDMI cable. For some reason, the DVI doesn't work very well. So because it's being forced down to 30 Hertz, it does act a bit flaky on that, but it's still perfectly playable. It just doesn't look as good as it does on this. So you can see here there's a kind of submersion effect. That was a real pain to do. The water was supposed to rise halfway through, but I had to code it like 7 times. Was it 7? 6 times. Once for the Spectrum, one for the CPC, once for the CPC Plus, once for the V990, and once for the MSX2. It was an absolute pain. Because the way I did it originally on the CPC worked fine, but then when I realised, oh my god, I've got to code this for all these different hardware platforms, this one silly little effect. So I did make some simplifications to it. But as I say, it does look quite good, and I think this underwater part, especially on the CPC Plus, does look really good with the pinks and the yellows of the water. But as you can see, there's lots of really strange enemies and different move patterns and things. So there we go. Well, I'm going to pause the game now because I'm not going to show you the next boss. You're going to have to wait till the game comes out to see that, or just download the version 1. It's not changed. It's been improved a bit. The colours are better, but it's basically the same thing. Well, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed watching today. I hope you've learned something about how to debug if you're really stuck and you've got no debugging tools. It's basically very simple. Look what happens. Play it with multiple times and see if it happens every time, because sometimes it can be erratic. And then think about your code, think about how it works, and think about what your code could be doing that could cause the symptoms you're seeing. And you do learn this from experience. You know, if you see the screen suddenly switch to mode 0 when it's supposed to be in mode 1, well, you can be pretty sure the shadow register BC has corrupted and it's the firmware that's a problem, for example. Now, I've got a strong point with ChibiAkumas because it doesn't use the firmware at all. I can discount everything the firmware does. I don't need to worry about whether the firmware is causing the problem, because it won't be, because I don't ever use it. And so that allows me to think about, well, you know, what's going on? Well, what does my code do? I know what my code does. Well, what could my code have done that would cause the symptoms I'm seeing? Well, you know, the stack pointer's corrupt. Well, on the Spectrum, that could mean the screen memory's overwritten, because I know the stack pointer's just below the screen. It does come down to your experience of your own game and really knowing your game thoroughly. But as I say, the general things are look for the symptoms, work out what the symptoms could be, build test copies that try to mitigate those symptoms or disable chunks of the code until the game works again, and keep doing that until you nail it, until you isolate the problem and you can fix it. Again, thanks for listening and watching today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye now.